that time of the year again, folks. The springtime of youth. I'm here to offer my author's perspective on the subject of romance. So I'm going to compare two manga titles on the subject of romance that I found good. They're both high solid B, I would say. I mean, if it's really your thing, they might be low first class, above average, but not the greatest thing I've ever seen. But they're really good romance stories. Now, the reason why I chose these two titles is one of them is about more of a mature college romance, and the other one is about young, very entry-level high school romance. They have their different tropes they fall into, but I think they do them well, and I'm going to explain what makes a good romance in my mind, because I'm very picky on the subject, having enough experience personally that I'm really turned off by romance in the media, on sitcoms or any kind of television show really, for that matter, movies, books, including graphic novels or whatever. I don't find most romances to be realistic or believable or good or interesting for that matter. So these are two that I found that are good. Let's get into it. So I want to remind you that I'm talking mostly about the subject of romance, and I'm using these two different stories as examples, as various examples and source material for what I'm trying to say. These aren't really reviews. I've already given you my rating of them. I mean, I might do a review on one or both of them later if Don Juan says, hey, you know what? I think it's a good idea to do a review of this title. Go out and put it out. But right now I don't have the plan to do that. I originally had these on my to-do list. I actually did recordings for both of these. They were not up to my quality, and I didn't want to put them out, so it just sat in my folder and I didn't edit them. So when I came up with this idea, the author's perspective, this is one of the things that actually jumped out in front to me. But I just had the coincidence, I was in the situation where it made sense to start out with Darker Than Black and Frasier. But these two titles were one of the prime examples that I wanted to do the author's perspective on. So just like I said, just a reminder, I'm not going to super break down either story. I'm not here for that kind of review or discussion. I'm here for the discussion of romance. Kind of mostly in manga, but just in general, when it's told in a story. So here's the skinny. Just to put this out there, romance is trope. It is cliche, it is formulaic. There is nothing wrong with not being super original or anything when it comes to romance, because most people fall in love in a fairly similar pattern. I mean, not everybody obviously, but the vast majority of us kind of follow these different things. That's why it's so relatable to us, and that's why there's so much of it out there in the entertainment media. So going on with the cliches, I know it's going to sound like everything you've ever read ever in a manga in both of these titles, but it's like I said, having tropes, it's hard not to have those. You want something that's original, that's groundbreaking in that regard. Read The World God Only Knows. That's one that just super metaphysical, avoids all that shit, and sometimes goes along with it. It's very, very witty, very clever. It's very good at avoiding and not falling into those pitfalls. The deal with Hetakoi is college guy. He goes to Hot Springs alone. I mean, for his 20th birthday, he's a lonely guy. I don't think he's ever had a girlfriend, if my memory serves me right. It's not that important. But he ends up seeing a naked woman just flat out spread-eagled, in the bushes or something at the hot spring, because she ended up drinking alcohol and passing out because it was too hot and she dehydrated herself. This is the basis for his awkwardness towards this woman. I mean, he actually doesn't seem to be particularly awkward with women in general, just with her, because that's how he ended up meeting her, and she, at least for a portion of the story, doesn't know that he met her in this manner because she was unconscious. So from here, I mean, he goes into college. He ends up going to the same college as her, obviously. He chooses the same club as her, which is the Hot Springs Trip. I don't exactly know how to describe this, but they're like a club that's focused on researching different hot springs for people to go vacation to or whatever, and they review them, blah, blah, blah. Kind of like our project, but with hot springs. So, important references to this story as I do this recording. The main character's name is Komai. I will be referring to him as Komai. And his main love interest is Ruka. So, Komai, Ruka, Hetakoi. Alright, so the deal with CIGUATERA and why I think it's worthy of being in this discussion. CIGUATERA is about some high school kid who is bullied, with a friend who is bullied as well. I mean, that's in the subject of romance, that's not important, but it is important in the story. And he ends up taking driving lessons in secret because he wants to ride a motorcycle. So he wants to get his license for a motorcycle. And that sort of thing, I guess in Japanese culture and society, very restrictive, I guess. You know, having part-time work or full-time work, or learning to drive and all that stuff as a high school student. Apparently it's kind of taboo or something from what I picked up in anime and manga. So, I mean, I'm not 100% on that. Feel free to chip in if you have good knowledge on that. It just, in this story especially, that kind of was a focal point of him learning to get his license in secret. So the main character of CIGUATERA is Ogino, and his main love interest is Nagumo. So CIGUATERA, Ogino, Nagumo. So getting into kind of a little basic of the story of CIGUATERA, it's a very, I don't want to say it's by the book. It does do a lot of things that other high school romance mangas I've read adhere to, but I think it does it better than other ones. The guy is, you know, obviously he's bullied, which is very common and shown in anything, but this is actually a seinen title. He is an overthinker and a worrywart, and that's something that you see it a lot in manga and everything, but the way he does it just, it seemed more relatable to me from my own experience when I was around that age as a cat, roughly, you know, because cats are just babies and then adults. But I mean, from my experience when I was getting in that in-between area, I kind of was a worrywart like that. It's like, I would find that sort of thing annoying with this character, but it was usually kind of funny with him. I mean, it's sad but true, but also a little funny. And I think that right kind of chemistry made the story easy to deal with and made following the character easy to deal with. As I mentioned, both of these stories follow tropes, and I'm going to actually have the subject of tropes versus pitfalls later on this recording. In this one, main character's love interest mistakes romance budding between her best friend and Ogino. Very common sort of setup right there. The guy's an overthinker, like I said. The heroine, overly naive, and we will touch up on that too because it's actually a little bit disturbing in this story particularly, but we'll get back to that. The two lovers end up at a love hotel, a very exclusively Japanese thing, but it's like the name suggests if you're not familiar with what a love hotel is. Characters break up, which is actually something that also happens in Hetakoi. I mean, so that's a subject I'm going to talk about, is the split up and the secret keeping. That's a very cliche romantic thing that's worth talking about for both stories as well. So off the top of my head, those are cliches that both these stories, I think, share. As I talk about one of the whatever subjects, it turns out they don't both share it. Whatever, we'll still talk about it. But let's get into it then. You know, this is what I think makes a good romance. I'm going to start out with tropes versus pitfalls. What exactly I mean by tropes versus pitfalls is, a trope is something I think the audience of a story can cope with. They might not like it, but they can accept it. It can be good, it can be done well, but it can be recognized as unoriginal and cliche. It usually just comes off as cliche at worst. A pitfall is a problem to the story. Like, one of the worst ones, I think, when it comes to romance, it's not specific to manga, but it is a huge problem I have with romance in manga, is the protagonist being a doormat. But by that extension, many sitcoms and actually, frankly, any stories, whether it's a movie, a book, or whatever, the biggest problem I have with the protagonist is they are a doormat. This is not interesting for me to watch, read, or experience. It's not entertaining. I mean, sometimes the situations, you know, situational comedy, it can be funny, but the fact that the guy is a doormat is detractive to me, and that includes with romance. If I'm a fucking doormat, I don't see a woman being that interested in me. And by my experience, when I was desperate for romance, to be in a relationship, and I was desperately trying to seek that and make it happen, try to force it, the women were not really that interested in me because I was a doormat. That is an example of a pitfall versus a trope. The guy can be kind of a wimpy pushover, but I mean, in the end, they need to have some things they can stand up for themselves on or be able to respect themselves over with. Like, pretty much, again, cliche, but this is romance. If you can't love yourself, how can somebody else love you? Well, as somebody experiencing the story, if I apply that to the main character, and I don't see that guy being able to love himself, what the fuck am I doing experiencing this story? You know, I can't believe that the other person's gonna love them. It happens sometimes, but seriously, pitfall. The protagonist is an overthinker. This is another cliche that can often be played off for comedic effect or for dramatic effect. But it can be a pitfall and ruin the story when it's not believable. Okay, so I mentioned that Ogino is a warrior wart in CIGUATERA, and he is. But I see it realistically the way a teen boy that age would be. Often in manga, it's to the point where it's unbelievable, like I said, unbelievable. But with him, it's like, it is kind of wild and it is kind of funny, but it's mostly funny because it's sad, and that's believable. Versus going through all this extreme stuff. I pair this with passive aggressiveness, which I really dislike. You get a lot of quote-unquote situational quote-unquote anything, usually comedy, when somebody is super passive-aggressive and they're going through so much trouble to find out things like they think their lover is cheating on them, so they go through like all this spying, all this other crazy bullshit, instead of just directly talking to the person like you should. Pitfall. Dumb. I'm sorry, it's not interesting to me. I mean, once in a while it could be done right, but this is mostly sort of a pitfall situation. Now, that's different than the character being a warrior versus being unrealistically passive-aggressive, basically. That's the difference on that. And to add to that, there is a little bit of that in Hetakoi, just so you know, but that's part of what makes it realistic, is that you can't always just fully trust the other person. Sometimes you see things or you overhear things, which is, again, cliche, but romance is cliche. And you have misunderstandings. Sometimes you're too afraid to confront the person. This is different than going through a lot of crazy bullshit situations and trouble to not directly talk to the person. There's a difference between a misunderstanding and just being the problem yourself. So there's that topic in my mind. The main love interest mistaking romance budding in between the protagonist and their best friend. This is often included in a romantic anything. And I think mostly because it's safe. I don't see this as a pitfall very often, but it's extraordinarily cliche. So this is one of those things where it's like, if it's not super drug out or if it's done believably, hey, whatever. Because romance can be wishy-washy. As much as I don't want to have my romance that way and my story be that way, especially in the beginning when two people are getting to know each other and they aren't able to complete each other's sentences and just know what the other person's going to do. There's a lot of guesswork. That is believable. That is understandable in the beginning. Not so much later on, but towards the beginning, that's why it's in a lot of romance. Because it is believable. Not often a pitfall, but CIGUATERA has this. Hetakoi does not. And it's not any worse for not having it. There's nothing wrong with not having any cliche that's normal to romance in your story. It doesn't need all the bullet points to be a great romance. It just needs to be believable in my mind. And that's what these two stories are. They are believable when it comes to the romance aspect. Not mentioned on the list, but I just thought of it. The love interest is some wealthy socialite or inheritor of some giant fortune or something like that. And the protagonist is some nobody Joe Blow who works at a supermarket or some crap. Neither of these stories have it, which is why I didn't think of it, but pretty cliche with at least anime and manga. Worth mentioning it, again, the difference between a cliche and a pitfall is it believable? I don't usually think this is believable, but it does happen, in real life, so, it's a cliche for a reason. Another one. Character ends up at a love hotel, usually with their love interest. Usually they don't have sex. I'm not going to say whether or not that happens in CIGUATERA. This does not happen in Hetakoi to my memory, but my point being is this comes up a lot in anime and manga. Usually doesn't end up in sex, which is understandable because it's usually for teenage boys, but this is not believable. I don't know how hard it is to find shelter, but there's a lot of situations where this happens and the romance does not progress at all. Like, you're in a love hotel, you don't have to talk about sex, but you just bring up, your feelings for each other or something, and this almost never happens. Not believable. I know people are shy, or it's awkward, or whatever. The whole Japanese society seems to be very introverted for some reason. I don't know. But As an American cat, if we're going to end up in a love hotel, sex is at least probably going to be joked about a little bit. And that's kind of a testing the waters thing, you know. From me personally, I mean, that's what I would do. So, like, when characters end up in a love hotel because they have to spend the night for whatever reason, and nothing happens, and keep in mind, like I said, it doesn't have to be sexual or romantic. It could just be like advancing the relationship, which does not have to involve actually talking about a romantic interest in the two. It just needs to happen. Not believable. If you get stuck in a love hotel, or just a regular hotel having to share a room with somebody, and you're not both exhausted and passing out, like as soon as you get in there, you're both awake for some time, your fucking relationship better advance somewhat, in some way, or your romance is not interesting or believable. Breaking up. Breaking up happens in romance, let's face it. Most people don't fall in love and then have one straight shot until one or both of them die. When you fall in love with somebody and you end up spending up like the rest of your life with them, you usually break up once or more times. I mean, that's just how it is. That happens in Hetakoi, and it happens over a misunderstanding, and the way it happens, kind of melodramatic, but understandable. The best way to put it is people break up. Even people that love each other who end up staying together with the rest of their lives, they break up. That's just how romance is. So I think that a lot of romance not having a breakup often kind of hurts the believability, and then on the other side you have romances where the couple's like, oh fuck, I don't know. Do they really break up? Well, comes to mind, Inuyasha and Kagome from Inuyasha never seem to really stick together or get together. I don't fucking know. Their romance is a mess. You don't watch that show for the romance. That's ridiculous anyways. You're just watching it for them to kill demons. Alright, secrets. I was saving this towards the end because there's secrets in both Hetakoi and CIGUATERA, but it's a really big thing in CIGUATERA, whereas in Hetakoi it's really more of just kind of a misunderstanding for the most part when it happens. So in CIGUATERA, Ogino was bullied, as I mentioned. This is not very important in terms of romance. Outside of Ogina keeps this as a secret from his love interest, Nagumo. And that's understandable, that's believable, you know, but at some point, the guy's got to tell the girl, look, this guy bullied me, or as I was bullied in high school, you know, he doesn't have to get into detail about it, but he needs to do it. And spoiler alert, guess what, he does. You know, and the way that she reacts to it, and the way that their relationship is affected by him admitting this, to me, was realistic. That's why that is not a pitfall. Whereas in a lot of other anime and manga, the guy is like flagrantly bullied, and often the love interest even is aware of it and sees it happening like on a regular basis. And then what? Sometimes the love interest stands up for them, which is like, I suppose it's supposed to be sweet, but it's really just kind of sad to me and not that interesting. I understand some people can't stand up to bullies themselves, but this does not often make up for a good romance. It doesn't. It's not very interesting to me personally. It might be interesting to other people, but I have never met anybody that's like, oh, that character stood up for this character who was getting bullied forever, I don't know, for fucking like 2 years or whatever, that this other person knew them too, keep in mind, and they finally decided to stand up for them. That was the start of a good romance. That is so romantic. No, that's boring, and that's a pitfall, and that's not believable. The love interest, in this case, both of them being women, overly naive. Often a cliche even outside of anime and manga, but usually not entertaining or interesting for more than a few punchlines. In both of these stories, the main love interest is naive to varying degrees from each other, and I think for the age of both of the characters, it was done appropriately, and in terms of the story as well as the romance, it's done okay enough. In CIGUATERA, Nagumo is overly naive to the point where like she repetitively gets herself into really bad situations, and after the first couple times it starts to become like, oh god, come on man, it's like, is something really bad gonna happen to this character because she is that dumb? Versus like normally in an anime or manga, they're oblivious to the other character's feelings. Well, on the other hand, with Hetakoi, That's Ruka's problem, is that she's so naive and trusting. She fails to pick up on Komai's feelings. And that's often very, very frustrating for the audience, as extraordinarily boring. But both CIGUATERA and Hetakoi are very short stories. I think they're like 5 and 6 volumes respectively, which to me is a very short story in terms of manga. So obviously it's not done that long, even if it's done for the entirety of the story, which it isn't. I think the length of that is what keeps it from being a pitfall, because it can be understandable, it can be relatable, it can be not especially interesting, but I mean, you can relate to it, it's believable, and that's the most important thing, as I've been saying with romance, is that it's just generally not portrayed as being believable. But in this situation, in both the stories, maybe Hetakoi more so than CIGUATERA, they're both believable levels of naivety. And I saved the last most important thing to me, besides believability, which it ties into anyways, obviously, for a discussion. And I'm actually going to talk about this probably fairly in depth, unlike all the other ones, which I was just saying, this is what makes it a pitfall, this is what makes it cliche. Chemistry. If these two characters are not good together, why would I care about experiencing their romance? Right? Like, you see this a lot in sitcoms, movies, television, anime, manga, I guess cartoons. I mean, I don't know how much romance is in cartoons, but like, if the two characters aren't good together, why the fuck do you care? I mean, unless it's like done funny and funny very good, then really, what am I doing here? So, obviously, I mentioned both these stories because the characters are good together. That is one of the most important things in our romance. The super worrywart, overanalyzing, kind of overly spastic Ogino with Nagumo, good pairing. I mean, she's kind of overly naive, as I mentioned before, but fairly more easygoing, a little bit more outgoing. They match well. They are a good couple. Their interactions as their romance develops is good. They are good for each other. It is good reading about them being together and seeing what they do. Mostly like a real couple would, mind you. There's that teenage awkwardness, but it's not to the point where it's like full retard. It's just on a believable level. So watching them being the way they are together is an interesting story. Keep in mind with CIGUATERA, romance is only one aspect of the story. There's like some other crazy bullshit going on which to varying degrees might be believable or not to the audience, but we're talking specifically about the romance. So, in terms of the romance, they are good together. Said it a bunch of times, but it's interesting to watch them and hope they stay together or whatever. So, like, when the characters are good together, you kind of become committed as the audience to hoping to seeing them succeed. If they're not good together, you don't care or you want to see them split up. Does that sound good? No. So, with Hetakoi, same deal. The two characters are good for each other. The main guy, Komai's nickname is Grandpa. Grandpa Komai or just old man? I think it's Grandpa because he's just like a really old-fashioned guy. He's very respectful towards women, not to like over politeness, just like he has common courtesy, which is not really part of that age demographic as well as, you know, even in our entire society really over in America. But Ruka is also kind of like a complimentary sort of personality to go with that. Like, the best way to put it is their personalities are mostly matching, and seeing them together or developing a romance together is good, because when you look at the two of them and you know, as you learn more about both of them and everything, they are good together. That's what makes it a good romance, is that you want to see them be together. If they have problems, as an audience, you want to see them get past those problems and be together. Because they are good together. They're interesting to see together, instead of seeing like a guy and a girl who don't belong together at all because they're super opposite or whatever. They're complementary. They're good. It's a good romance. Now, unlike CIGUATERA, romance is the main focal point of Hetakoi. So, I think the fact that the author chose to make two characters that are, for the most part, fairly normal and college kids and have them develop a romance together that's believable, even with like some of the dramatic cliches and stuff that happen that cause problems to arise and everything, it's still good because the chemistry is there. Like that song that says he does the right things, he says the right things, all the exact right things at the right time, or whatever the exact lyrics are. That's like real romance, and for the most part, that's kind of like life. You don't fall in love usually because you're saying all the wrong things and doing all the wrong things at the wrong times, like in most anime and manga, and frankly in most romantic stories ever. That's not what happens. It's you usually doing and saying the right things and being at the right place at the right time. And that's kind of what Hetakoi is. It's mostly that. And I think it's good that it's not completely that, but being that it's mostly that, it's a mostly believable romance. You see the chemistry between the two characters actually working, actually clicking. That's the whole point of being with someone, is because you like being with them. You get along with them usually. You like the answers they give you. You like the actions that they do when they're in different situations. That's chemistry. That's, I mean, outside of even romance, that's chemistry. But inside of romance, that's what draws people together, is chemistry. Looking back at it, in this sense, Hetakoi is actually amazing in the fact that it's not amazing with this concept. That's what makes its chemistry great, is that it's not wildly crazy. It's just how it is, for the most part. Whereas with CIGUATERA, like I said, romance is only like one of the aspects of the story, but it's good in CIGUATERA because Ogino and Nagumo are good together. A lot of times when Ogino's like freaking out or whatever, overreacting or overanalyzing things, the words, the actions, whatever, when Nagumo is presented with that situation, the way that she meshes with him is good. It's chemistry. Whereas when you take a typical romantic anything, they usually do or say the wrong thing, which leads to some kind of misunderstanding, drama, blah blah, boring, pitfall. I mean, I understand every relationship has that, has misunderstandings, has not a perfect synchronicity. That's life. But that's not the same thing as it being mostly that, which is what most romance is from my experience, is mostly that. And that's why I don't like it for the most part, because it's just not believable. The chemistry isn't there. Chemistry is the most important thing in a romance. I've kind of dissected my feelings about those two romances in general without like going super spoily into it. But some other good mentions. We've talked about both of these before. Onani Master Kurosawa and Molester Man. And despite their names, because they're ridiculous names, very good. I guess Onani Master, not really a romantic title, but the way that the story's told, the potential for romance is there, and it's believable. And it's like, even though it's a weird setup and everything, the chemistry is there. With Molester Man, despite the name, the guy doesn't molest anybody, just to be clear. Fantastic romance. And you know why? Because it's based off a real story. Like, the artist found this story on, I think, like Reddit or something like that, and he turned it into a manga. Because it was a real story, the chemistry was there, and it was believable. Because it was real. That's what makes that a great fucking story. That's like a borderline Hall of Fame story for me. There's something setting it back, like the artwork, for example, is very sketchy looking. But in terms of romance, like just ignoring the platform of media it is and everything, and just thinking about it as a romantic story, that is a Hall of Fame story to me. It's not a Hall of Fame manga, unfortunately, but it's a very romantic story, a very believable story, fantastic chemistry that's believable, that's real. Real. That's why that's a great romance. So, after all the planning and prepping and brainstorming and everything that went into this, I mean, this is the result of my idea, that I actually came up with when I originally thought of the author's perspective thing. Was this and another recording that will be coming out soon. I had two ideas. Thoughts, comments, join the discussion. We're on Facebook. Just search up Planet Tyro. Tyro spelled Tyro, like thank you, Roger Ocean. And you can get a hold of me at _oldboy on Twitter. You can find our whole archive on YouTube. Just search up planettyro.com and it'll take you to our YouTube page. And, you have anything to say about romance in general, you have some questions or whatever, you want to know more about my feelings on CIGUATERA and Hetakoi, which I don't know if I'll do recording on it or not. I mean, this is kind of more my focal point this year than doing discussions. Add to the conversations on YouTube or on Twitter or on Facebook or whatever. So, see you around. Don't fall into any pitfalls. If you do, that's a bad romance.